part of injury and violence prevention. We do product safety and rape prevention education. One of the areas we are the lead on is suicide prevention in the state of Illinois. And so one thing that I'd like to do as I get familiar with everything is with our in our area of injury and violence prevention, we have a motto where we want people to live to their full potential. But we know if they're being injured or if they're dying, that they're not able to do that. And so that's a motto for us. And we also reflect that within our suicide prevention work, that if people are dying or being hospitalized or being injured, that impacts them living to their full potential. What you'll see up here is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And usually this is the point where we say, can you take out your phones and put on silence? I want you to do the opposite. I want you to take your phones out and program this number into your contacts. That this is a national number anybody can call. You do not need to be in crisis when you call. It could be you're concerned about a loved one, or you're concerned about a student, or you're concerned about a family member, or even if you have questions yourself. Anybody can call this number. You don't have to be in crisis, but it is the national number that that people call. Is 1-800-273-TALK, which is 8255. And so we want to make sure people have that handy. I tell you, it's not the easy. I mean, I still have to stop and think, what's that number? Even though I say it all the time. I've had to pull this out at a football game as I had a parent tell me that their child had been hospitalized, and just wanting some information and just a source, something that I could give them at that point in time. And so it's handy to have this number at your fingertips in your phone so you can call if you ever have any questions. And so fortunately we're able to do a lot of things we're doing in the state of Illinois because we do have a federal grant through SAMHSA to do youth suicide prevention. I'm also passing around some wallet cards that has this number on it, so if you still are looking for that number, it'll be on that sheet. So I'm going to have to learn to not use the mouse and just use the return key. So back in 1999, the Surgeon General did make suicide a public health issue, and there's a few assumptions we can definitely make. With the field of with suicide prevention, it's a very complex issue. There's different factors that can go into play. There could be some individual, some environmental things going on. But the one take-home message I want you to have is that this is a community-wide problem. It's something that takes a community-wide approach, whether that's at your school level or in your community as far as your town or your locality. But it really does require that everybody is involved. And one of the mottos within suicide prevention is that everyone has a role. This is not just something that the mental health folks are going to deal with or the counseling center, it's their job. Everybody has a job. And so that's the main take-home message, is that to recognize everybody has a role. So what we're going to talk about today, because we are public health and we like our data and we want to make sure everything we do is data driven, we want to talk about the reality of suicide here in Illinois. Also, what school personnel can do. And it's my understanding most people attending the conference either are in the field of education or just the fact that you're in higher ed, that there are things we're going to talk about that are going to be useful for you in the school environment to know about. I put in some slides about bullying and suicide, so we'll build on what the keynote was talking about this morning. And then just kind of tell you what we're doing here in Illinois. So the reality, so not to do a pop quiz or anything, but when you think about suicide, as far as the leading causes of death in Illinois for adolescents and young adults. And just so you know, our grant that we had federal funding on is from 10 to 24. So we're talking about middle age, high school, and young adults. Those are in higher education. So the leading causes of death for that age group, what do you think suicide is when you rank it in the leading causes of death? Do you think it's the 8th, the 2nd, the 1st, or the 3rd leading cause of death? Yeah, it is, yeah. 2nd? Any other? 3rd? It's actually the 3rd. What do you think are the first two? Car accidents, yeah. So motor vehicle crashes is definitely number one. We wonder how many of those are actually intentional crashes. And so, we do wonder about that. What I can tell you is that we do lose over 1,000 people each year to suicide. Of those 1,000+ folks, how many do you think are in that age group, that young adult, youth and young adult? 403, 200, 125, or 80? It's actually 125. So I think the last year statistic we had close to 1,600 folks that had lost their lives to suicide in Illinois. And so 125. So it's a smaller number. But what's important to know with this age group is the suicide attempts. So when we look at the number of youth who attempted suicide annually in Illinois, what do you think? 300, 700, 1,500, 3,000? 3,000, absolutely. So it is they are at higher risk for suicide attempts. And just a true false, for those that are, who attempt suicide, are they at greater risk of repeating that? True. Gotcha. So just to recap our Illinois data. So for the youth 10 to 24, it is the third leading cause of death. We do lose about 125 young adults to suicide in Illinois. Approximately 3,000 do have to seek treatment in an emergency room. And so when you think about a classroom of about 30 students, know that about 2 of those have attempted suicide in the last 12 months. Now we know that it doesn't just start out by attempting. We know it's a continuum of care, a continuum of events, and it starts out with suicide ideation. And so the Illinois State Board of Education and the Chicago School District each have a survey they do with schools. And on that survey, the Youth Behavior Risk Survey, it asks some questions about suicide. Have you considered it? Have you thought about it? Have you had a plan? Did you need to seek medical treatment? And so what it did tell us that in the last survey, that of the high schoolers in the last year, that 14% of them did report considering thinking of suicide. 13% had actually a plan. 8% had tried to take their life, and just under 3% actually needed medical care for that. And so again, it talks about the continuum of the thought process, that you think about it, you may think about it, you may not have a plan. Well, then you might have a plan, and then if you have a plan and then you're accessing means, and then you actually try and then attempt, and then those attempts can lead to death. And so there's a continuum of things that happen that lead up to a suicide. What is something unique is that there is the violent death reporting system that looks at the violent deaths. It's actually a national system. Here in Illinois, we collaborated with Lurie's Children's Hospital in Chicago to start piloting that system in a handful of counties. What it does is, the death certificate doesn't tell us as much as we want to in the prevention field. So in the world of prevention, we want to learn from those that have died or that have been impacted from injuries and violence. And so we want to have a bigger picture of what led to that event. And then that helps us kind of strategically plan some of our prevention strategies. What are things that we need to be talking about in the prevention field? How can maybe we be altering the things that we do in prevention? And so this unique system is that they look at not only the death certificate, but they'll look at the hospital discharge, the hospital information, they'll look at police reports. Sometimes they're able to interview the family, and so they can start to piece together what were some circumstances that led up to that event. And I'll tell you, working with Lurie's, fabulous people that are working there, very dedicated to injury and violence prevention, but they also admitted at the very beginning of the project that they were surprised at how many suicides were in the violent death reporting system. And so I want to say about half of the violent deaths that were in that system were suicides. And so what we did find is when we were looking at the age group 15 to 24, which would be our high school and our young adults, we were looking at what were some of the mental health circumstances. And so what we found was about a third of those young adults, youth that died of suicide had a current depressive mode. About a third of them had a history of mental health problems or treatment, and about 40% of them had a current mental health problem. We also are interested in knowing what might have been some precipitating circumstances. So sometimes you'll hear about, well, they just had a fight with their boyfriend or their girlfriend. So we kind of wanted to know what were some circumstances going on before that. And what the data had showed us was that about 23% had some type of crisis 2 weeks before their suicide. And that 4% had a financial problem. You know, with the other age groups, that number fluctuates. But that just under 30% had a problem with a current or former intimate partner, and that about 15% had some type of relationship problem, whether it was with a friend or a family or other. So there were some things going on that precipitated that existed prior to the suicide. And then lastly, we were looking at substance use. When I first got involved in the field of suicide prevention, the question, what we were always told is that it's a three-pronged approach. You have public health, you have mental health, and you have substance abuse. All three of us have to be working together. And so we were looking at what was the substance use involvement with those that had died of suicide in this age group. And we found that a third of them had a blood alcohol level, a positive blood alcohol test when they were when they had the toxicology test. About 6% were victim of alcohol dependency, and about 10% had substance use problems. So it gives you a little insight into just the impact that substance abuse has on the situation. So in our national suicide prevention strategy, we learned that there are definitely certain populations that are higher at risk, ones that we are more concerned about. We talk about the American Indian population. We talk about middle-aged men. We talk about those that are attempt survivors or who have lost somebody to suicide themselves. We talk about those that have been involved with that are a service member or veteran or family member. We also talk about those that are LGBTQ. And what's interesting is what we've learned is the term has been expanded in the suicide prevention world to be LGBTQ2S. And the 2S means two-spirit, because and one of the high-risk populations are American Indians. And so in their language, they were explaining that they didn't have a term to explain LGBTQ. And so in their world, in their environment, they call it two-spirit. And so, but you know, when we look back at the survey that the state board does with youth, it does ask a question about LGB. And so it does ask about those that, and I tell you, they were really fascinated to have this data a couple years ago because it was actually started to be weighted data. And so they were able to ask those that perceive themselves as LGBT or questioning. And so they were asking, they looked at the data of those that identify themselves to compare to their peers that were their non-gay peers. And what they found is that they were 3 times more likely, the LBG youth were 3 times more likely to have to have suicide thoughts and to have suicide plans, and 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so it just reinforced why this is a population that we are concerned about and that are higher at risk, and that we need to recognize that they're struggling and they have challenges that might impact their some suicidal ideation. So some of the risk factors, because somebody will ask, well, why does somebody want to die of suicide? And so so what we learn is that there are chemical imbalances that can lead to depressive modes or other mental health disorders. We also know there might be other circumstances like drug problems or alcohol problems or family violence or trauma. But we also know is that with our youth that when they feel so overwhelmed with these problems that they don't always know what the solution is, and so that's when they start to consider suicide. And so for them to know that there is that support, and to be able to recognize that those are risk factors. And there are some other risk factors to also consider. You know, if there's been, we used to say that whenever there has been a life change, you know, you've had a death in the family, you've had, there's been some changes, some relationship problems, bullying, legal issues. In our town, we had, over a few years, we had several prominent people in our community that died of suicide, and learned later that there were some legal issues that were associated with that. And so there's some other risk factors that can put somebody at risk. But what's important to know is that even though people might have those risk factors, doesn't mean that they're going to attempt suicide. And so what's even more important to recognize are the warning signs. So even the risk factors can kind of help you identify maybe some people that might be at risk. It's really the warning signs. And what we say is if you start to see the things on the left, those are things that you want to call 911. You want to stay with that person until they are linked with services. And so if they're talking about, if you have somebody that's threatening to hurt themselves or to kill themselves, if they're looking for ways, they're looking for means to do that. So if they're seeking pills or weapons or other means, or if they're writing about dying or writing about suicide, those cause concern. And so this was actually put together by the American Association for Suicidology to help identify the difference. It was kind of a two-tier approach. It's like, what do you do when you start to see these warning signs? And so those were definitely serious enough that you need to call 911. The other ones here on the right are more that, you know, these are concerns, these are warning signs, and it's important to link them to a professional, mental health professional. So if you have somebody who is feeling helpless, if they're increased alcohol and drug use, that there's dramatic mood changes, if they're feeling trapped, they don't feel a reason to live, that those are concerns that you want to be able to ensure they are linked to some professional. And so the American Association for Suicidology actually put together this nice numeric about is path warm. So if it's somebody that has ideation, substance abuse, purposelessness, anxiety, trapped, hopelessness, withdrawal, anger, recklessness, or mood changes. So it's kind of just a way to remember some of those warning signs. So we can't talk about risk factors and warning signs if we don't talk about protective factors. And the interesting thing about protective factors is that they aren't always the opposite of what a risk factor would be. It really is about being able to instill those promoting strength and resiliency with youth and for anybody actually. So it's really talking about what's going to protect people from suicide is being able to ensure that you have effective care, that you have effective clinical care in place, both for mental and physical and substance use disorder, that you also have access to interventions, and that you have strong connections with family and support groups and with your community, that you have limitations to access to means, and that you also are able to have the skills, the coping skills that would be needed. Also, cultural and religious beliefs can be a protective factor. If you have a belief that is against suicide, that can be a protective factor. And so the main thing is that these are all things that can help protect a person, but it's not something you can just do once. You can't just do clinical intervention once or do an intervention once. It's ongoing, and so that should be something that is maintained with folks. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, who we collaborate a lot with, they actually have a document on connectedness being a best practice as a protective factor. And it's recognizing that having connectedness at multiple levels, both at the individual, at the community level, was really important. That you really want to have people that you want to feel connected with individuals, you want to feel connected with your community, you want to feel connected with institutions. So if there's services and different systems in place, that you want to know that you can connect to those. And so it really is being able to have that connectedness. So let's just go ahead and talk about the school's role. And there are 4 reasons why a school should be concerned about or be looking at suicide prevention. One is just that, maintaining that safe school environment is definitely part of, school's overall mission. The other thing is that we know that a student's mental health does impact their academic performance. We also know that if you have a student that dies of suicide, that impacts your whole school community. And then just lastly, there have been schools that have been sued for neglect. And so failure to notify parents, get assistance, or to have adequate supervision. And so just some reasons why. And for those that do plan to work in within schools, within the high schools, actually, there is a school code requirement that those that are working within grades 9 through 12 be trained in not only recognizing the signs of suicide, but then also knowing how to respond, what appropriate intervention or referral techniques to have. Part of that school code also says that if you attend a training, then that can count as as part of your professional development. And so there is a school code requirement for those that work in high schools to be trained. I'm sorry, it's 7th through 12th. So this is the great book that I always like to share with everybody. So SAMHSA, the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, put together this toolkit for schools. At the bottom is a link of how you can download this for free or even order a copy. But this book provides much guidance on what schools can do. And so I do like to spend a few slides just talking about what's in this so you know when you leave here what you have access to. And so again, how schools can help is having that school-wide promoting connectedness and emotional well-being. But it's also important that you have policies in place. It's important to have training. It's important to be able to have things in place for your students and for screening. But what we always have to be very clear about is that this is considered a very comprehensive approach to suicide prevention in schools. And it's very important that you take it in stages. And so what's important is that you need to have these 2 things first before you do anything else. Every school should have their protocols in place. And so there's protocols that you have for the students that you feel are at risk, and then protocols for if you do have a student that dies of suicide. And so so when you're looking at the students, wanting to have to help those students that are at risk, this guidebook, I wish I could get it to stand up, but this guidebook really does include some sample protocols, some on how to help a student. If you find a student that you have identified that is at risk, it has some guidelines of how to notify a parent. The keynote was speaking earlier today about the parents in the schools talking, and so has some guidelines on how a school can notify a family of their concerns. But then also guidelines on how to refer a student. So once you've identified a student, where as a school plan to make that referral, what's the process, the protocol you're going to have in place, but then also how do you document that. For those that you're responding to students that have maybe attempted, so if you've had a student that's had a suicide attempt, this toolkit talks about just again some sample protocols and some guidelines on like how do you facilitate that student coming back to school. And so some really concrete things, because that's sometimes is the question is, we've had this situation, but we're not sure really how to deal with it. And so there's those samples in there. But it's very important that these protocols are in place before you start looking at education and awareness and screening and other things. And so the next thing is, what do you do? You know what, let me just go back, because there was something else I did want to mention, and that's not going to do it. Previous. So I didn't touch on the protocols for responding to if you have a suicide death. So why is that important? We know that death can impact anybody, especially for youth. And so any death can be profound and have an effect on our youth. So, you know, if our youth have somebody who's died at the same age, then it really does challenge their vulnerability. If they have a death of a role model, then they can have some conflicting views where there might be some, you know, they feel that loss, but then they also might feel some betrayal. But we also, as we mentioned earlier, that there's some difficulty associated with that. If you have, if you've lost somebody and that you've had to deal with somebody with death, that there is some difficulty focusing on your academic performance then, because you have all this other on your mind. And so you just need to be prepared to help students adapt in the short term, but you also need to be prepared to adapt to help them in the long term. And that knowing that the impacts, you know, the emotional kind of fallout of somebody who has died is going to, it can continue months, even years afterwards. And so really wanting to be able to have those protocols in place of how you're going to address those. So that's why it's so important that these protocols are part of an immediate response protocol plan that a school would have as part of their crisis response plan. So again, you know, this book does have different scripts of what the office would say, what staff would say, kind of announcements, you know, how would you make an announcement of that, you know, in your school, letters that would go out to family. But it also talks about how do you work with that family who just lost their child, and that was a student in your school. So it has some guidelines on being able to work with the family and just some talking points. But it also talks about what are best practices for what happens on the anniversary, because there's been concern that sometimes you can, some of the memorialization of a suicide on the anniversaries can actually be glamorizing it, and so you want to be very cautious about how you do that. And so, so again, this toolkit includes some of those guidelines for that. So once you have those protocols in place, you definitely want to be able to train your staff. You want your staff to know that that it's important to have an increased awareness. That not only is it important for them to recognize that that suicide does pose a risk for students, but that you as a school also are taking this as an important step to address. And so you want to be able to train your staff of the importance of suicide. You want to be able to also train effective, a selection of mental health professionals to certain staff in your building that are going to be able to assess the suicide risk of individuals. So then after that, you can get to the third phase, and that is determining whether you are going to start educating parents, if you're going to do some screenings, if you're going to do some education with the students. And so what you can do with parents is there's some opportunities where, like during freshman orientation or through PTO or other events, where you can really start to talk to parents about the issue of suicide prevention and mental health wellness and so forth. And so they can be integrated into some parent education. So there's some chapters in here about how you can work with parents. But just be aware that when you start talking to parents, you might start seeing an increase in the number of referrals. So that's why it's so important to have your protocols in place and have your staff and teachers trained. And then if you do decide, as an option as part of your comprehensive suicide prevention program within a school, is is, training students. One of the benefits of training students is that we know that many times students are going to tell their peers before they'll tell any of us, any of the adults. They'll say, a peer will hear something, a student will hear something before we will. And what we also know is that of the students that have had a peer disclose to them, only a fourth of them actually told somebody. And that's a lot of responsibility for a youth to have on their shoulders, to be told that from a peer or a friend that they are struggling, and then having to deal with that on their own. And so it's important for our students to know how to handle those situations. And so, when a school would look at how to train or to do some programs with students, there's 3 different ways you can do that. You can do it as a curriculum base, where you can really just kind of more broad, kind of what we call gatekeeper training, just giving them some information, just promoting those protective factors, being able to increase their ability to be able to recognize those that might be at risk, and then encouraging people to get help if they need it. You also can take the approach of providing skill building for those students that are at risk. And then there's also screening that you could do, with some peer leadership. So there's some programs that look at peer-to-peer leadership, and so that is another approach. So then, lastly, is about screening, and the screening is that everybody, there are students that might fall through the crack, or as the keynote talked about, are good at just hiding not revealing what their concerns are. So the screening helps you identify those that maybe not be identified in other ways. So kind of to get started, if you work in a school, or if you're wanting to start that conversation in a school about doing more about suicide prevention, is that you have to just remember that, again, everybody has a role. There will be different people in your school that you are going to want to bring together. There's everybody's going to have a role in that, and also recognize that the school doesn't have to do it themselves. That you really can outreach to your community professionals, those that are working in the field, that can really provide some added support and advice and guidance along the way. And so, if you have a school that is looking at wanting to implement any of those phases of a comprehensive program, there are some just different steps. You want to make sure that you do engage your administrators, your school board, and other key players. Just explain why you think this is important. We have plenty of data. We have county level data that we can share, and so that's information you can share with your stakeholders to say, this is what we're seeing. And so you can point that out and have some data to really show that. Also know you're going to have to engage people within your school and in your community, and then that's when you can move on and actually do a plan. So again, in the toolkit there is a kind of a checklist of doing that. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center is sprc.org. In this book, we'll have kind of a matrix of the different programs are available. So if you want to do screening, what you can do, what are some best practice ones. That is changing all the time. Every week they're adding things to that registry. So it's better to go to the website and just kind of click around and see what's been proven to be a best practice. And so when you click on the hyperlinks, then it'll give you information. So like this one, it will tell you after a suicide toolkit for schools is intended for middle and high schools. As a guide, it's a protocol strategy, and it helps meet some of the national goals. And I'm just looking at the time, and I'm realizing I'm going to go a little bit faster. So just bullying and suicide. I provided you a copy with this publication. It's the relationship with bullying and suicide. With bullying and it's been in the news more, and so what CDC wanted to do is really take a closer look at that. And so so what this did is look at the research. And so, what we know about bullying, what we heard earlier today is that it's repeated, it's serious, we know it has negative effects, and that it can impact everybody involved, the ones that are bullied, the ones that bully, the ones that are bystander. What we know about suicide, again, that's complex, and that any involvement in bullying behavior can be one stressor for suicide. And so what we do know is that bullying behavior and suicide-related behavior are closely related, and that we know enough about it to make some evidence-based recommendations of how to improve it. But what we don't know is if bullying actually causes suicide-related behavior. And the example that we're given is about drowning. So we know that one of the leading factors of a child drowning is not having adult supervision. So even though the adult wasn't there to provide the supervision, they didn't cause the drowning, but there was a correlation there. And so that's what we talk about bullying, that we're not in the field at the point where we could really say that the bullying caused the suicide. We know that there was an indirect impact on it. So what is correct for us to be able to say is that involvement in bullying, along with other factors, do increase the chances of a young person engaging in suicide-related behaviors. And so again, we just know that they both are public health concerns, and that there's circumstances, again, at different levels, at the individual and social and family and community and society level that impact it. And we know that protective factors can help reduce those behaviors. In the handout, kind of talks about what the research is, what we know, and so that is in there for you to look at. So what we know, what a school personnel can do, and then some more resources to get more information. Wanted you to know that next Monday that there is going to be a webinar on the relationship between bullying and suicide. So if that's something this is a topic area you're interested in, there's more information on that webinar and some resources. Just want to share that SAMHSA does have their no bullying app, and so I want you to have that information. And just a little bit about what we're doing here in Illinois. We really wanted to be able to use our federal funds to increase more training within school personnel, but then also expand our Only It Takes One public awareness campaign, which we collaborate with the Mental Health America of Illinois on. We, of course, are asked to promote the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And so then we're also doing some different stakeholder meetings where we're talking with, like a year and a half ago, we were meeting with campuses of institutions of higher education about what strategies they can do on campus. And we're going to have that same conversation with the juvenile justice system and with substance use providers. But one thing I want to make sure you know about is that we did purchase a license for some online interactive trainings, kind of avatar type approach. We purchased a license for 9 courses. There's one for middle school, one for high school school personnel, and then we also have one that is address understanding the challenges of LGBT students. Those are the 3 we have at the secondary level. The other 6 are at the higher ed level. And so what we do have are a training for just at-risk, general, knowing, being able to recognize, intervene, and approach and refer somebody for higher ed faculty, and then we have one for students. And we have similar approaches for for faculty to understand the challenges of LGBTQ students, and then for how higher ed students can understand that among their peers and other students that they may encounter that are LGBTQ. The other 2 programs we have, the higher level is regarding veteran students. So again, for the faculty to understand the challenges, but then also there's a peer-to-peer veteran student training that is available. These are all available for free. It's something we purchased a license for, so we have it available for the next few years. But it is a best practice, and it's a way to have a engaged, effective way to have some dialogue. And so for those that, the courses at the middle school and high school, people are able to get ISB credit for that. It's really easy to implement, like, have everybody in your school take the training and then get together afterwards and debrief about, questions and remind them what their policies are and where to refer people. But basically what happens is you enter this virtual world and you assume the role of the teacher, Mr. Bauer, and he's having a conversation with Mariah. And so it really navigates you through some of the questions, the conversation you might have. The one reason why the department picked this training is that, for one, it was online. It was going to be something you could implement broadly, but also because it not only identified and referred, but it ensured that you had practice having a conversation with a student. And if you have that conversation with a student, they're more likely to follow through with whatever referral you have. And so basically, that's what the next few slides are talking about. And so what happens is you get 3 profiles. This one's about Mariah, Jen, and Michael, and it kind of increases with severity. So Mariah's struggling with bullying, Jen is having outbursts, and she's the one that's actually bullying Mariah, and then Michael's more serious, where he's talking about suicide. And so it kind of talks you through, it tells you where you can kind of undo things. Can't always do that in real life, undo a conversation. But what happens, and at the bottom of each of these slides is a link of how you can access these trainings, which is illinoiscognito.com. But it also includes some other additional resources. And I would do a demo, but I know that will interfere with the folks next to us. And so just want you to know, as we wrap this up, that there's some other resources that are handy. There is, After a Suicide, a toolkit for schools. Also, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They have posters and magnets that you can order for free to have up in your schools or in your facilities. This is the wallet card that we passed out. And then, again, Suicide Prevention Resource Center is the go-to place. It really is. They have these fact sheets on the roles, so like the role of a high school teacher, the role of a mental health professional, the role of teens. What do teens do? And then this is the Only Takes One website that we collaborate with Mental Health America on. And you'll notice at the very top there's different levels, like preventing suicide, the different tabs, preventing suicide, understanding it, stories, and it's just, there's so many layers of information on there. So I do encourage you to visit it. It's onlytakesone.org. And then my information, so make sure you get out on time, because I know lunch is next. So feel free to email me or call me if you want more information or want a copy of anything, and we can be more than willing to help you out.